Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gail Kurtzman, and on behalf of Betsikva Synagogue and our Adult Education Committee, I would like to welcome you today. This is our last session of our lecture series with lawyer and researcher Eric Gertner. And of course, today's lecture is a hot topic. We'll be discussing pandemics, Jews, and vaccines. And just a reminder, you saw I turned on the recording. So if you don't want to be on camera potentially, please turn your camera off. We will be going over today, probably finishing around 2:15. But if you have questions or comments, please direct them in the chat. And I have an extensive list of sources for you from today's class, and we'll be sharing that with you afterwards. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Eric.
Thank you, Gail. So thank you all for still staying with me and attending these various sessions. I think today's session is a really interesting one because it's really probably the most current of the sessions that I've done. The first two, as you may know, were historical. Last week's was more current, and this week will be very current. And because it's very current, I thought I would start with, first of all, here's a picture of a memorial that was set up about the beginning of October in Washington, D.C., where a flag was set on the mall for every person who had died at that particular time of COVID-19. They started with 650,000 flags. And as they were going along, during the time that they were setting this up, they had to keep adding flags because at the time there were significant deaths occurring up to like maybe 10,000 a week. So the numbers of the flags had to be increased. And people could write a message for their loved one who passed away on the flag. And there's lots of pictures of this memorial and lots of pictures of the people writing things on the flags, and sometimes you can read what they've written. It's quite a moving shot from the air. It takes up virtually all of the National Mall, which is a huge area in Washington, D.C., which extends from the Washington Monument to basically the Lincoln Memorial. So that's the picture I wanted to start with. So we can take that picture down. Here's some recent statistics about vaccines as we're dealing with kids and vaccines in Canada in particular recently, and in the United States for the age group between 5 and 11. Here's some stats on kids, including the group between 12 and 17. And some of these are US and some are Canadian. Half of all 12 to 17-year-olds in the United States have been given a vaccination or will do so immediately, so say their parents. 27% of the parents of 5 to 11-year-olds will say that their child will get vaccinated right away. 1/3 of the parents have taken the position that they will wait and see. 30% approximately of parents will not vaccinate their 12 to 17-year-olds. And 2/3 of those parents will not vaccinate their 5 to 11-year-olds. Not wait and see, they will just not have them vaccinated. So that obviously has serious implications and ramifications for dealing with COVID. The main reason that has been given by the last group of the parents of the younger kids is they're concerned about the fertility, the effects on fertility of the vaccine for that younger group. That's point number one. In Canada, the statistics are a little bit better. Angus Reid conducted a poll for parents again for kids of 5 to 11 years old. 51% that said that they will have their kids vaccinated immediately, 18% would wait, and 23% said never. In the case of 12 to 17-year-olds, the number for Canada, I think, is about 86% have been vaccinated. To me, that number is high from what I've heard before, but hey, that's all I can find. Some other interesting news from the past week. The New York Police Department, the employees of the New York Police Department were challenging the the city's vaccine mandate in court, and the court threw it out and said the mandate was valid. You probably heard about the comments from Dr. Deborah Birx, who commented on the Trump administration's response to COVID. And her estimation is that by taking their eye off the ball or not following the recommendations of the specialists, there were approximately 130,000 people who died unnecessarily. I also saw a statistic not this past week, but earlier, that the COVID has resulted in 140,000 kids being orphaned, which means either both parents died or their only parent who was taking care of them had passed away as a result of COVID. So that's pretty scary stuff, and we need to take all of this very seriously. Okay, so let me get to the crux of the matter, and that's Jews and vaccines and this pandemic. Jews have been touched by pandemics in a variety of different ways. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about Jews historically and how they've been affected by pandemics. And then I'm going to talk about the response of Jewish scientists in particular to vaccines in a variety of different contexts. And then I'm going to talk about the more, some would say, esoteric or practical issues about vaccines and the law. So, of course, you may know that during the Black Plague in the 14th century, Jews were held responsible for the Black Plague in many communities. Thousands of Jews throughout Germany and in France and in Spain were killed and murdered as a result of the belief on the part of the non-Jewish community that they were responsible for the Black Plague. Obviously, that had a major impact on Jewish communities throughout Europe. And it's important to recognize that a third of the population of Europe died during the Black Plague. So you can see sort of the concern that people had, but the way that they dealt with that concern is they lashed out at the Jewish community. Insofar as the plague that hit England in the 17th century, I have not found any real evidence that Jews were being held responsible for that. That may not come as a surprise, or maybe shouldn't come as a surprise, because, as you know, Jews were expelled from England in the 13th century and were only allowed back in legally after that plague in the middle of the 17th century by Oliver Cromwell. So it's sort of hard to blame the Jews when they're not there poisoning wells and taking kids' blood and whatever. Spanish flu, again, I think there's some evidence that Jews were being held responsible. But again, because the Spanish flu pandemic occurred 100 years ago, we need to remember that Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 and for the next 100 years, or they were compulsorily converted to Catholicism. So again, it's sort of hard to blame the Jews when they're not there. That doesn't always apply, but it certainly applied apparently in those two circumstances. Insofar as the present pandemic, of course, I discussed last week, all these Holocaust comparisons. What's even worse is to read some of the comments that are being made about Jews' responsibility for the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm just going to rattle off a few of these comments from a variety of different sources. There's an article in Haaretz that says, Jews control the Chinese labs that are the source of the COVID-19 virus. So Jews are responsible, obviously. The American Jewish Committee said global trends in conspiracy theories linking Jews with coronavirus. There's lots of those. The Jerusalem Post says there are 1 in 5 English residents believe that Jews are responsible for the pandemic, and that's part of a Jewish conspiracy. COVID conspiracies fuel anti-Semitic incidents in the UK, reported by Reuters. Anti-Semitic flyer in Germany blames Jews for the COVID pandemic. That's from the Sun Sentinel newspaper. COVID-19 was created by organized Jewry. That's a story that was published in the National Post. I mean, just reporting what other people are saying, obviously. And of course, the famous bête noire of the right-wing conspiracy theorists is that George Soros owns the Chinese lab, and he's the one responsible for the pandemic. So this is not a pretty picture, and I'm not sure it's going to get any better. At least during this pandemic, we've had some compatriots being blamed for the pandemic. As you all know, that there's been a great deal of hostility towards Asian Americans in particular, and to a much lesser extent in Canada, who are blamed for the Wuhan flu or the Kung flu or whatever bad things Donald Trump decided to call it. So they're also a target of a lot of people, and their physical assaults. And the recent report from the FBI on hate crimes for 2020 showed a dramatic increase in hate crimes against all groups, especially Asian Americans and Jews. And that's a similar report from Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. So this is all not terribly good for the Jews or for Asians at this particular point in time. All of that is despite the efforts that Jewish scientists, among others, have made to deal with terrible scourges, pandemics, over particularly the last 150 years or so. We are all familiar with the contribution of Salk and Sabin to eradicating polio in North America for the most part, and eradicating polio in most parts of the world. In fact, all of that took place in the 1950s. There were, of course, some people who opposed vaccines during the polio epidemic. What I've been able to find so far is that polio vaccines were not mandated, which as a young child, I don't remember my parents having a choice. And I think because the polio vaccine majorly affected children, parents obviously wanted to make sure that their children were vaccinated. And if they got polio, the picture was a very ugly one for the child's future. So that's of course in our lifetime, but before that, there have been other contributions to the development of vaccines. And they, as I said, go back about 150 years. One of the most important of those contributors is certainly somebody I'd never heard of before. His name is Waldemar Haffkine, and he is one of the first major developers of a vaccine against cholera. He was from, I believe, Russia, and eventually he ended up in France and worked at the Pasteur Institute. He eventually moved to India, which was a hotbed of cholera, and was recognized as a major contributor to the salvation of many Indians on the subcontinent as a result of his efforts to create this vaccine. And also he created a vaccine against the bubonic plague. He was recognized by Queen Victoria in her Diamond Jubilee as a special recipient of an honor. And he was called by other scientists as the savior of humanity for his efforts in developing these vaccines in particular. Again, it's not somebody I had ever really heard about, but is obviously somebody who's very important in the development of vaccines generally. So let me move on now. So that's the first one. The next major contributors to the safety of individuals by the creation of vaccines, and Jews in particular, are two scientists who were caught in the Nazi maw in Europe. The first one is a fellow by the name of Ludwig Hirschfeld. He was Jewish. He had converted to Catholicism But of course, for the Nazis, that was irrelevant. He was still a Jew. He was eventually sent to the Warsaw Ghetto. And in the ghetto, he, among others, helped to develop safety precautions to try to deal with typhus epidemic in the crowded conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto. And there's been a recent study which indicates that a lot of those efforts probably paid off, because at some point in the middle of the Warsaw Ghetto, there was a huge drop in the number of typhus cases in the ghetto as compared to the general community in Warsaw. And the belief is that the measures that we're now familiar with, washing your hands, keeping a safe distance where possible, and to some extent having access to vaccines, even in the ghetto, helped to save many Jews. Now, they may not have ultimately saved them from the death camps in Europe, but at least they were effective to keep people alive for as long as they could. The next one is a fellow by the name of Ludwig Fleck. He's another Jewish scientist, and he started in the Lvov ghetto. He was sent there by the Nazis. Eventually, because of his expertise, he was sent to Buchenwald to help develop typhus vaccines for the German soldiers and the German people. And he is somebody who had previously worked with a fellow by the name of Rudolf Weigel, who is another major person involved in the development of vaccines. And Weigel was not Jewish, but he obviously shared the concerns about what was happening to the Jewish population. And in his laboratory, he helped to hide Jews from the Nazis and save the lives of a number of Jews, and has been recognized for that as a righteous among the nations. But back to Fleck. He is working in Buchenwald and developing a typhus vaccine for the Nazis. And he does, in fact, develop a vaccine that's effective, but not for the Nazis. That vaccine is used for the Jews in the camp in Buchenwald. He also creates a vaccine for the Nazis, which is not quite as effective. And of course, there's some issues about why one is useful and one is not. And obviously, Fleck knew how to make the vaccine for the Jews in the camps effective. He also knew how to ensure that he could create a non-effective vaccine for the Nazis. So Fleck is a very important person for helping Jews to survive the war. He survived the war himself, and he later moved to Israel and was recognized as an important scientist in Israel. I've already talked about Weigel. I've also talked about Salk and Sabin. Even in more modern times, so post Salk and Sabin, we've had a number of Jewish Nobel Prize winners for their work on developing vaccines. There's a scientist by the name of Baruch Blumberg, who was awarded the 1976 Nobel Prize in Medicine for his work on the Hep B vaccine. Another Argentinian Jewish scientist by the name of Cesar Milstein was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1984 for medicine for his work on the development of something we've all learned about in the last few years, monoclonal antibodies. So that goes back as far as 1984. And of course, in more recent times, we have other people involved also in the development of monoclonal antibodies of Jewish persuasion. Drew Weissman, who was recently awarded, along with another scientist, I think the Lasker Prize. And then we have the individuals involved in two of the major companies that have developed vaccines in Moderna and Pfizer. The main scientist at the time at Moderna was Israeli by the name of Tal Zaks. The founder of the company was another Jew by the name of Robert Kaplan. Insofar as Pfizer is concerned, you probably all heard about Albert Bourla, who is the CEO of Pfizer, whose parents were able to survive the massacre of Jews in Thessalonica, where 90% of the Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Also, the chief scientist of Pfizer is a fellow by the name of Mikael Dolsten. He's a Swedish Jew whose who eventually moved to the United States and is working for Pfizer. And his mother was a Jew who was able to escape Austria and the Nazi regime. So we have those stories of people who developed vaccines over the last 50 years, from going back, or 70 years, I guess, going back to Salk and Sabin. But there are also some other Holocaust stories involving efforts to save Jews from the Nazis by using fake typhus vaccines, or fake patients with typhus. So there's a story of the development of, or the creation of a type of typhus called Syndrome K, which occurred in Rome, in a hospital in Rome, directed by a non-Jew, but he had 2 young Jewish doctors working with him. And what they did is they basically created a ward for Jewish patients who had apparently caught this Syndrome K form of typhus. And because it was extremely virulent, they were locked in a ward. And even when the Nazis came to check out what was going on at the hospital, when they were told that the people in this ward had gotten the Syndrome K typhus, which was terribly virulent, and the Nazis were terrified of typhus because of their experience during the First World War, they refused to go into the room, and they said, that's fine, okay, we'll just leave them alone. So a number of those Jews were able eventually to escape as a result of this fake Syndrome K. And there's a somewhat similar story where a number of Jews, but not as many as was the case in Rome, were saved by 2 Polish doctors in a small community in Poland, Dr. Eugene Lazowski and Dr. Stanislav Metalevich. They were also involved in the creation of a ruse against the Germans to help save the Polish community, as well as a number of Jews. And what they did is they were able to create a virus which would show up as the person having typhus positively, but it was not strong enough to cause anybody to get really sick. And as a result, they could label these patients as patients with typhus, and therefore the Germans wouldn't deal with them. And therefore they were able to save, as I said, both Polish members of the community as well as some Jewish members of the community. So that's the connection between Jews and pandemics and Jews and the creation of vaccines. There are also a number of Jewish women who've also been involved in the creation of vaccines in more recent years. And I can send links to those stories to Gail if people are interested, and I'll do it, and she can distribute it to those who perhaps request them. So let me now turn to some of the legal issues. And I think it's important to start off by giving you an explanation of how both the Human Rights Code and the Charter work, and the reach of each of these important constitutional or quasi-constitutional documents. The Charter, as you may know, applies to governments and government actors or government action. The Human Rights Code applies to private enterprises as opposed to just the government. So when you're talking about actions taken by the government with respect to coping with the pandemic, those actions can obviously, to the extent that it's relevant, could be challenged under the Charter. Where we're dealing with private enterprise, those issues generally come under the Ontario Human Rights Code, or the equivalent at the federal level, or the equivalent legislation across the country in the different provinces. And so what's the difference? So as I said, the Charter applies to government action, government actors. And the way that a Charter case evolves is the following. If a person has a complaint that any of their rights under the Charter has been infringed by a government actor or government action, they file a lawsuit and complain that whatever right they're concerned about has been infringed. Obviously, that has to go to court, and eventually the court case unfolds as follows. They have to prove that the right that they're relying on has, in fact, is broad enough to cover the activity that they're concerned about, that the action has, in fact, infringed the right in question, and then they've proven their part of the case. It's then up to the government either to argue that the right doesn't apply to the conduct that the person is complaining about, or that the government action is in fact saved under Section 1 of the Charter, which says that any action by the government that is prescribed by law and that is demonstrably justified and sets a reasonable limit and is demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society will nevertheless, even though it infringes a right, will be considered to be valid. So just to take an example, if you claim that your religious rights or your right to religious freedom has been infringed by the government limiting the number of people who can attend a church service, the person challenging the government's action says, I have a right to freedom of religion. It's protected by Section 2 of the Charter. The government's action limits my right, and therefore I've proved that my right has been infringed. The government then has the responsibility of saying either yes or no, that the right hasn't been infringed, but even if it's been infringed, we can show that given the circumstances of this pandemic, what we have done to limit that right is prescribed by law, is a reasonable limit, and is demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. And the Section 1 test is basically an ends justify the means analysis. And I won't get into the details of that because it can get quite complicated. And of course, we've seen many government actions that have been challenged already. And they've been challenged by people relying on the Charter and people relying, on the other hand, on human rights legislation, which applies to private actors. So if your employer says you have to wear a mask to come to work, and you say, no, I'm not going to do that, it violates my rights under the Ontario Human Rights Code, then you can bring a complaint. You have to prove your complaint. You have to show that your right has been infringed, and then the employer will be able to say, no, the right isn't infringed, or that I have properly accommodated that person, and therefore the action I've taken is justifiable. And we've seen, as I said, many cases already. There have been challenges to mask requirements in British Columbia, Ontario, Alberta. I think virtually every one of those cases that I've seen have failed because, especially in the case of private individuals relying on human rights legislation, they have not been able to rely on a particular provision of the Human Rights Code that says your right not to wear a mask is protected. It's not discrimination on a ground set out in the human rights legislation, like religion or national origin, et cetera, or sex, or whatever rights are protected in the human rights legislation. Vaccines raise a different problem, and we'll get to those in a minute. What we have seen with respect to vaccine challenges, they have basically involved government action. So they would be challenged in Canada under the Charter, in the United States under the Bill of Rights, depending on what ground they're relying on. Usually it's a ground of privacy or freedom of religion or something else. And I need to put these recent challenges in a historical context. This historical context is this. In 1905, the US Supreme Court had to deal with a challenge to a vaccine mandate in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And they relied on provisions of the Bill of Rights to say that their rights are being infringed. Their case was tossed out by the US Supreme Court. So that's over 100 years ago. It predates the Spanish flu. but it dealt with, I think, a smallpox outbreak in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts legislature decided to mandate vaccines against smallpox, and obviously that order was challenged. And here's some of the things that the court said. It says the defendant insists that the liberty is, and the defendant in this case, I think, is the complainant. The defendant insists that his liberty is invaded when the state subjects him to a fine or imprisonment for neglecting or refusing to submit to a vaccination, that a compulsory vaccination law is unreasonable, arbitrary, oppressive, and therefore hostile to the inherent right of every freeman to care for his or her own body and health in such way as to him seems best, and that the execution of such a law against one who objects to vaccination, no matter for what reason, is nothing short of assault upon his person. But the liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States to every person within its jurisdiction does not import an absolute right in each person to be, at all times and in all circumstances, wholly free from restraint. There are manifold restraints which every person is necessarily subject to, a subject for the common good. That's the important phrase. You can impose certain restrictions, even in the US, which we all know people talk about these absolute rights that they have. There can be some restrictions on these absolute rights when you can justify them. And in this case, the justification was the common good. If people aren't compelled to be vaccinated, this smallpox outbreak will affect everybody in the community. It says, on any other basis, organized society could not exist with safety to its members. Society based on the rule that each one is a law unto himself would soon be confronted with disorder and anarchy. And I would argue we're seeing actually a lot of that in the United States in particular, but also in Canada at the present time and in other countries. Real liberty for all could not exist under the operation of a principle which recognizes the right of each individual person to use his own, whether in respect of his person or his property, regardless of the injury that may be done to others. This court has more than once recognized it as a fundamental principle that persons and property are subject to all kinds of restraints and burdens in order to secure the general comfort, health, and prosperity of the state, of the perfect right of the legislatures to do which no question ever was, or upon acknowledged general principle ever can be made so far as natural persons are concerned. So basically the Supreme Court of the United States basically said, look, there is no such thing as absolute freedom. We all know that there are restrictions. And in this case, they said, look, this is for the common good. Otherwise, if everybody's allowed to do what they want, there would be chaos. But in the case of a pandemic, it would not just be chaos, it would be the deaths of thousands and thousands of people. And that's, as I said, more than 100 years ago in the United States. Since that case, which is called Jacobson in Massachusetts, there have been more recent cases dealing with the pandemic. And virtually in every one of those cases, that line has been more or less followed. Most of the cases have not dealt with the merits of the case in the detail which Jacobson did, but they all have come to a similar result. So we have a case challenging the vaccination mandate for students at the University of Indiana University. That mandate is challenged. The courts throw it out. Applications to the Supreme Court to overturn it are dismissed. They refuse to hear the case. There have been cases out of Maine. There have been cases out of other jurisdictions, all of which the Supreme Court of the United States has rejected to hear. And arguably, there's no point in hearing it because there is a binding precedent in that Jacobson case and in some even earlier cases, but not at the Supreme Court level. So it would be folly to try to deal with the case in the situation of a pandemic, which is even broader than the pandemic that the court was dealing with in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts case. The other thing I think that people have lost account of in the context of this pandemic is and it's touched on by that that statement about common good. If you look at the Charter of Rights in Canada, of course, there are many individual rights mentioned in the Charter. The fundamental freedoms set out in Section 2, the rights in the case of criminal cases in Sections 7 to 15, the right to vote, the right to travel, in effect. But there are also a number of provisions that recognize what I'll call collective rights. So the Charter itself recognizes that sometimes the collectivity is more important than individuals themselves. And I can point to a number of those provisions. The Charter protects the rights of Indigenous people in Section 25 and in Section 35. It makes a specific reference to women's rights in Section 28 of the Charter. Language groups, English and French, are recognized and given certain rights where members of those groups constitute a minority that warrants education in their own language. And there are similar provisions dealing with New Brunswick, which recognizes French and equal rights equally. Section 15.2, which deals with equality rights, recognizes the validity of affirmative action programs to deal with the rights of a minority. And Section 27 of the Charter recognizes the important concept of multiculturalism in Canada. So we've recognized a lot of collective rights, and I think you have to read the Charter in the context not just of the individual rights that are set out in the Charter, but you also have to deal with the notion that we all have collective rights. And certainly the right to live and be healthy, I would say, even though it's not specifically mentioned as such in the Charter, is a right that any court would recognize. So we can deal with more specific situations. And let's talk about employment situations. Gail and I were talking before we started about various questions in the context of employment. Can an employer impose a vaccination mandate or a mask mandate? One of the lawyers who is a specialist in employment law basically has said he doesn't believe any court will find that an employer's imposition of mask mandates or vaccination mandates would violate the Human Rights Code of Ontario or similar codes in the other provinces. And the reason for that is, again, this sort of common good that we all talk about, but don't necessarily adopt all the time. I think there are a number of interesting cases dealing with vaccination mandates in particular. I think mask mandates are they're really a non-issue, I would say. But vaccination mandates are different because they do affect your bodily integrity. And of course, what we have seen happen, certainly in the United States, and to some extent in Canada, is an effort by employees to try to rely on the religious exemption provisions in human rights legislation, saying, "Oh, you know what? My religion says that interference with my body through a vaccine is something we don't condone." And more importantly, and in a similar vein, people rely on claims of medical exemptions from vaccines, saying, "You know what? I can't get a vaccine because I might have some deleterious effect if I take the vaccine." What the Ontario government and experts have said is that people claiming a medical exemption are going to be very few and far between. It's probably less than 1% of the population who may have a justifiable claim for a medical exemption. And that's, as I said, not only been recognized by the government itself and the public health in Ontario and other places, it's also been recognized by the College of Physicians and Surgeons, who have basically warned doctors against granting medical exemptions without some real basis. So it has actually resulted in the College of Physicians and Surgeons issuing a statement on public health misinformation, which is what they called it. But here's the statement. It says, the college is aware and concerned about the increase of misinformation circulating on social media and other platforms regarding physicians who are publicly contradicting public health orders and recommendations. The physicians hold unique position of trust with the public, and there's a professional responsibility to not communicate anti-vaccine, anti-masking, anti-distancing, and lockdown statements, and or promoting unsupported, unproven treatments for COVID-19. Physicians must not make comments which provide advice that encourage the public to act contrary to the public health orders and recommendations. Physicians who put the public at risk with their statements can be disciplined. And we've already seen in Ontario a number of doctors who have in fact been cautioned and suspended temporarily. Similarly is the case in British Columbia, where doctors have been warned against making these kinds of false statements, and also warned against providing medical exemption letters without a real justification. It's even worse in the United States, where there are a number of doctors who are aiding and abetting the anti-vaxxers, I would say without any scientific basis for their particular patient requiring a medical exemption. Religious exemptions obviously become much more difficult because religion is something that the court has said relies on a person having sincerely held religious beliefs. What I find interesting, however, is that of the major religions, there isn't a single one that tells their adherents that vaccinations are against their religion. That's true of the Jewish religion, Catholicism, Mennonites, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. None of them will say that vaccinations contravene their religious tenets. So I find it very hard to believe that people will be able to claim religious exemptions. What's much more problematic, of course, is if they do claim them, what does the government do? Or what does an employer do? Does he challenge or it challenge the claim that it's against my religious or conscientious belief to get a vaccine? That's just a recipe for endless litigation. So those are some of the important legal issues that are arising because of the vaccine mandates that are existing. We also have lots of issues involving vaccinations and children. This has been an issue for a long time, but I think it's important to sort of understand the historical origins of some of the distrust of the medical profession and the distrust of vaccinations. And it really goes back to the 1990s in particular, not that there wasn't any of this beforehand, but it really took on a life of its own as a result of a research paper that was published in The Lancet, which is a leading British medical journal. The article was authored by Dr. Andrew Wakefield and others. And the article claimed that as a result of research, they had discovered that the MMR vaccine, that's the vaccine for mumps, measles, and rubella, caused autism in some children. And that, of course, had caused a lot of patients to start to refuse to have their children vaccinated with the MMR vaccine. And that is really the source of a lot of the present day anti-vaxxer sentiment. And what's interesting about that claim, of course, is that shortly after that paper was published, another medical team tried to repeat the experiment or the research that that first team had conducted and discovered that none of the results could be established. And it eventually came to light that the results that Wakefield published were false and fraudulent. And all of this concern about the MMR vaccine was without any medical or scientific basis. Wakefield paid a price. His license was eventually revoked. He's no longer able to practice medicine, but he continues to preach his anti-vaccine nonsense now in the state of California as opposed to in England. And of course, people who don't know the full story will point to the problems with the MMR vaccine and that it causes autism, even though, again, there's no real medical basis for that. So that's a lot of the basis for the anti-vaxxer movement, but of course it causes all kinds of problems for individuals who are refusing vaccines and parents who are unwilling, as I started off at the beginning of this talk, refusing to have their children vaccinated because of their concern about the effects that the vaccine will have. That's not to say that vaccines can't have side effects. We know that. We know that even with the present Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca vaccines. But that doesn't mean that they are not, quote, safe and effective, which is the test under the Health Canada legislation and under the FDA legislation in the United States. Eventually, you have to trust the science. And in this case, we have hundreds of millions of cases of people who have been vaccinated without any significant medical concern other than the pain of a jab or perhaps a 24-hour discomfort from the vaccine, but that doesn't qualify the vaccine as unsafe. Of course, we hear all kinds of crazy theories about COVID and what the vaccines cause. My favorite is the one that you can find on the internet on YouTube with a doctor by the name of Dr. Tenpenny, who claimed that the vaccines caused people to become magnetized and they would attract metal and it would stick to their body. And when I talked about this in an earlier program, I said Dr. Tenpenny is about 9 pennies short in her knowledge about anything. And certainly not somebody that I would trust with anybody that I care. So there's a whole issue about the anti-vaxxer movement, but there's a whole bunch of issues that still arise with respect to vaccines for children in particular. Obviously, you can only give somebody a vaccine if they consent. In the case of children, the people who can consent for young children are their parents or their guardian. And what we've seen in Ontario, and I'm sure we've seen it everywhere in this country and certainly everywhere in the United States, is the division between parents, both parents who are divorced and separated, and even parents who are still married to each other. What we are seeing is a ream of litigation pitting one spouse against the other, each one claiming that what they're doing is in the best interests of their children or child. And eventually a court has to decide all of this. And virtually every case that I have read so far, the test that the court applies in all of these cases is what's in the best interests of the child. And unless the parent opposing the vaccine can come up with some medical basis for opposing the vaccine, the court is going to find that getting the vaccine, in the case of a child, a young child, is in the best interest of the child. In the case of children who are a little bit older, there's a further complication. And that is, of course, if they are unable to consent, even though they're older than 11, the parents still have the same control and ability to object. But the court can also find that, especially children between the ages of 12 and 18, they may in fact be considered to be what are called mature minors, which means that they can sufficiently understand the benefits and the risks of getting a vaccine. And even if their parents oppose the giving of a vaccine to their child, the child, him or herself, can say, I don't care what my parents say, I want this vaccine. And they can get the vaccine. And we've already seen some of those cases with vaccines. We've seen those cases with in other medical contexts as well. And that's certainly, I believe, good law. And again, if you're dealing with parental consent being necessary, as I said, the courts are always going to favor the best interests of the child, which is to stay healthy and to avoid getting sick. And even though the risks for a child are smaller than they are for older people, as I heard this morning on television, they still have the potential to get seriously sick. They can have long haul COVID like we've seen with adults. They can have brain fog. They can be out of commission for months. That is not a good thing for anybody, let alone for a young child. The last point I want to make is in respect of individuals who are unable to consent. So somebody who has dementia. And again, the legislation in Ontario provides for people to act as substitute decision makers. I haven't seen a Canadian case dealing with that issue, but there are now a number of English cases where the approach is more or less the same as it is with children. The court has to decide what's in the best interest of the individual. And the three cases I can recall, in each case, the court decides that what's in the best interest of the mature adult, but somebody who's incapacitated, is that they be vaccinated. Obviously, the court will consider a bunch of factors. One of the cases is quite interesting because one of the factors they considered is how did this person approach vaccinations earlier in life when they were able to consent? And in that case, the person had agreed to get every vaccination that they were required to get. And the court saying, look, you can object because you think this is not a good thing for your parent, but putting ourselves in the parents' shoes, clearly they would have consented had they been able to consent to the vaccine. Insofar as the employers are concerned, the last point I wanted to make is that employers have an obligation to all of their employees. They have to adopt policies that will ensure that their duty to all their employees is met. And if you have a workplace where people are crowded and work close together, the safest approach, one that would be consistent with the duty to protect their employees, is to require people to be vaccinated. Or if it's possible for them not to work there, but to work from home, or they might have to lose their job. And that is just the reality of what we're dealing with in the context of a pandemic. So those are my comments for today. I hope I illuminated some issues, maybe caused concerns about other issues, but I'm happy to try to answer questions that you might have.
We do have some comments in the chat that I'll read out before I, hopefully there's time maybe to get to my comments and questions for you. Hindi writes, what if someone has a DNR? Would that indicate thoughts about their thoughts on vaccination?
Yeah, well, usually the DNR should describe the circumstances in which the DNR is to be applicable. If it deals with, if I'm on a ventilator, that the DNR only applies if when they're on a ventilator and they have a heart attack or they stop breathing, then you can't resuscitate them. I don't think a DNR would necessarily indicate that the person doesn't want to be vaccinated if in fact that vaccine might save their life and especially assuming that they can recover from whatever illness has brought them to the hospital in the first place.
Another comment from Sherry, why is the best interest of the child considered for children while the best interest of the common good is considered for adults? Why isn't the common good also considered for children when parents disagree?
Well, I think effectively what the courts are saying, because they can't consent, somebody has to decide what's in their best interest. And it just so happens that what's in their best interest will also usually be in the best interest of the common good.
Also, Eric, can't remember if it is in your source list that you gave me, but could you please share with me, and I can send it to everyone, the document from the College of Physicians and Surgeons?
I don't think it is.
Talk about exemptions. Is there?
Oh, there's lots of stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
And I can send you some of the articles about doctors who have been a little wayward.
So And Hindi had another question about the medical exemptions. She's questioning if you have to show proof, and I believe you do, to your employer, or if you're, want to circumvent the vaccine certificate program, you need to show some sort of written proof.
Yeah, I think you do have to justify your claim for a medical exemption, and I guess the employers who are knowledgeable recognize that unless you have one of the two major concerns that have been identified from these vaccines, that medical exemption is not going to be recognized. And if the employee says, I disagree with you, well, they can fight about it, and I can tell you who's generally going to win. It's not going to be the employee.
Going back to when you were talking about polio, Howard has a question. How would you explain that parents were universally much more accepting of vaccinating their children for polio than they seem to be for vaccinating their children for COVID-19? I think I know the answer.
I think it's a great question. I think in the 50s, first of all, the implications of polio in many cases was certainly at the beginning, was a life living in an iron lung, which wasn't much of a life for a child or an adult. And of course, people who were not treated or received a vaccine, some of them lived into adulthood in an iron lung. That's not really a life. I think there was a general panic because it became quite prevalent at certain periods of time in the summer when kids were gathering, playing with each other. And I think parents, we'd just gone through a war. It was only 10 years after the war. And so I think people were much more concerned about the common good and protecting. These are kids in many cases who were born just after the war. So they were much more concerned about it. I think the main problem today is one, this sort of anti-vaxxer sentiment, but that anti-vaxxer sentiment is also fueled by an anti-science sentiment, which is quite significant. We see people challenging climate change, people calling COVID-19 a hoax. It was a conspiracy. People just don't want to believe what they don't want to believe. And I think that's much more prevalent than it would have been in the 50s when people had a much greater trust of the government. And, in the middle of the 1950s, when we had the polio pandemic, who was the president? Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had led the Allied forces in the defeat of Nazi Germany. Here's a political individual that people could trust and did trust. That made a difference too, I think.
Well, and I mean, as a parent, my children are older, but I understand parents' hesitation. We hear in the news, we hear that, children, they'll survive, they'll be sick. It's really not going to affect them. I don't know anything about this vaccine. I don't know what the long-term effects are. So I'd rather take my chances with the virus.
Okay, well, my response to that is, yeah, of course, parents are concerned about that. That's all legitimate. But relying on Facebook for your information, as opposed to your pediatrician for advice, that to me is idiotic. It's beyond idiotic. People should be concerned about the health and safety of their children. But I also think, you have to think, would you let your child play Russian roulette? Because you don't know which of those thousands of children are going to be infected with COVID and either will be seriously sick or will die. It could be yours, it could be somebody else's, it could be both. You don't know. When we have a vaccine, which, as far as we know right now, has been safe and effective, maybe you should put your money on something that will save your child's life without any risks that we know about, as opposed to, oh, wait, I don't know, we should send them to school without masks, they should hang out with people who have COVID, because it's just a hoax.
I want to talk about what's going on in Ontario. We can see this in the States as well, with the unions. So we have in Toronto, the TTC, we have TDSB with their teachers, and we're seeing a lot of pushbacks from the unions. I thought they would have been in favor of this, but I guess when the employer has decided that their unionized workers will be terminated if they don't get vaccinated, that the unions are really siding not with the employer. It really disturbs me when you're in healthcare, you're a teacher, you're working with the public, and we know that we are in a pandemic and this disease kills.
Yeah.
Why is there such pushback?
Well, you know, they obviously have their constituency. I think they're taking the pulse of their constituency in some cases. In some cases, the heads of the unions are actually acting what they believe is in the best interests of all of their members, not the people who just are opposed to vaccines. So, you know, I don't envy their position, but on the other hand, if they are supposed to be looking out for the welfare of their members, the result should be pretty obvious. I mean, I think, you know, one of the interesting facts that have come out the last couple of weeks is there have been more policemen who have died of COVID in the last year than any other cause on the job.
No,
That's
and
pretty
then
startling.
you see, I was watching the news, and you see a union union head from the United States. His answer is, "We're not anti-vaccination. We just don't like people telling us what to do." And I'm like, if you're not an anti-vaxxer, then this whole thing is moot because you've already had your vaccine. So what's the pushback?
Well, I guess my pushback is, you know, I understand why you don't like people telling you what to do, but you know what? When you're working, somebody is always telling you what to do, unless you're the boss. And when you're the boss, you can decide. But right now, you're not. You should drive without seatbelts. You should, you know, drive your car on the sidewalk because that's what you want to do.
Do you think in the future we're going to see, and I heard there might be a case in Alberta where people are suing the government or they are suing their employer for inaction and not taking enough precautions to save lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the problem with employers is a little bit complicated, because if you are injured at work, in many cases, your injury is going to be covered by what I would have called workers' compensation legislation, so you can't sue. So you can claim for workers' comp. And in another talk, I said, you know, the number of cases that have been filed with workers' comp related to COVID and the number of cases that have been accepted versus rejected, it's like 10 to 1. So workers' comp is covering a lot of the individuals who are getting COVID on the job. And so we're not likely to see many of those cases. You could certainly see other situations where you have an employer who's not covered by workers' comp, like a lawyer's office. If you don't take proper precautions, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. If you are running a business and you're not requiring people to follow government restrictions, like, you know, cleaning your hands when you walk in, covering your face with a mask, and somebody gets sick and it's traceable to one of your customers, affecting another customer, you know what? You've got a problem. And so, you know, if you're running a business or you're an employer, you have duties other than letting people do what the hell they want. You have duties to other people to protect them, as well as yourself.
We're going to wrap up now, but you did send me that other photo that I didn't put up. Would you like me to?
Sure.
That image, you could just quickly.
I'll describe it.
Okay. This image, can you see it?
I can see it. Yep.
Okay, so, good. Yes. Please explain this image.
Yeah. So when I talked about the Holocaust and the efforts made to protect Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and other places by figuring out a way to get them a vaccine for typhus, the Germans, from the beginning, the Nazis tried to convince people that Jews were like lice. Lice is what causes typhus. And so they promoted that idea with graphics like this. So when people talk about typhus and Jews, this is the reason why it was a big concern. And it was a concern in Germany because it was another way to fuel the support for the Nazis, because typhus was a big issue for the Germans during the end of the First World War, which of course is when the Spanish flu started. The Spanish flu was not from Spain. It actually started with soldiers returning to the United States from Europe, and it actually started in Kansas, not in Spain. But the German army was obviously very much affected, like Washington's army was with smallpox in the 1777 American Revolution. He's the one who mandated vaccines for smallpox to the American soldiers in the Revolution. So, you know, it's hilarious to see that great historian, Jim Jordan, say that vaccine mandates are un-American. They are the result of America becoming America, because without the smallpox vaccine, the American army would have been wiped out.
Thank you for going back to that image that I didn't show at the right time.
That's okay.
So this concludes your series, Eric. Thank you so much. We enjoyed each week. It went by so quickly. And I just want to remind people that if you missed any of Eric's previous lectures, they are all stored on YouTube. All of our recordings from all of our programs, if you missed them, they're on the Beth Tikva YouTube page.
And if people want to email me with questions, I'm happy to entertain them. Gail has my email address, and she can provide it to people, and I'll do what I can.
Thank you. And hopefully everyone can join us tonight. We have a program with Ellie, Family Baking, where we're just to switch topics.
Yep.
And it's going to be a monthly series. It's for the whole family. Come on. Tonight we're learning about cooking, baking with the basics. We're learning the basics, and I need help with that myself. So I'm going to be on tonight. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And thank you, Eric.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Yes, and we'll just keep on. I won't turn the program off. If people want to unmute themselves and have a word with Eric or myself or say anything, feel free to unmute yourself. I will turn off the recording, though.